Well, hello everyone. Please feel free to take your seats. And it is so good to have all of you here in the room today, as well as all of you who are joining us online, wherever you are and whenever you might be tuning in. I'm so grateful that we get to share this moment together. As Mandy mentioned earlier, today we're continuing a series that we started last week called Upside Down Kingdom, where we are exploring a significant piece of Jesus' teaching from the book of Matthew, known as the Beatitudes. Now, this particular passage, it forms the opening section of the Sermon on the Mount, which is a broader collection of teachings that Jesus gave to his closest followers and those who had gathered to hear what he had to say. And these teachings of Jesus essentially tell all people about the nature of God's kingdom, also referred to as the kingdom of heaven, and it invites people to be a part of it. Last week, I used these words to describe what this kingdom is all about. The kingdom of heaven refers to the rule and reign of God, where life is as God intended it to be, rather than what humans have made it into. And this kingdom, it looks and works differently than the way of our world. It values different things, and for that reason, it's upside down in nature. And the Beatitudes really capture this difference. But don't take my word for it. Let's have a read through them again in their entirety. Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Now, to those of us who are born and raised to believe that being blessed means a few other things, maybe it's having financial security, or maybe the absence of pain and loss and grief, to put value on the opposite things of these can sound kind of ridiculous. And yet, Jesus' teaching about his kingdom makes it clear that it is infinitely better than any kingdom that we may know. It's an upside down kingdom, but it's good nonetheless. And you and I, we're all invited by Jesus to experience it for ourselves, both in the messiness of life right here and right now, but also with the hope that we'll be able to experience it to the full extent in the future when all things are made new. Last week, we looked at the first beatitude, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." And we discovered that the beatitudes, they aren't a to-do list of things that we need to accomplish or attain in order to be blessed by God. We're not meant to pursue persecution or poverty or mourning. Instead, Jesus is describing different circumstances that people often find themselves in, which provide the opportunity for them to experience the kingdom of heaven. And in the first beatitude, Jesus blesses the poor in spirit, regardless of the nature of what they lack, whether it's money or food or resources or opportunity or spiritual needs. And I think that this is one of the major reasons why Jesus does this. Because it's when we reach the point of our own limitations and ability to meet our needs ourselves that the opportunity emerges to really rely on and experience the provision of God. And as we're about to hear, the same can be said of the second beatitude, the one that we're going to be looking at today. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. It sounds ridiculous, offensive even, because when you imagine the depths of grief and pain involved when you lose someone you love, then blessed isn't a word that immediately comes to mind, is it? Now, to frame this beatitude within its full scope of meaning, though, Jesus, he isn't just talking about the sort of mourning that accompanies the loss of a loved one. It's also a mourning about the true state of things, the state of the world around us, the pain, the suffering, the evil, the sin, and yes, the death. But it's also about the state of ourselves. our own failures before God, our own horrible choices and attitudes of our hearts that clash so fiercely with the goodness of God. And these types of grief and mourning are ugly and painful, and yet none of us will escape the reality of familiarity with these kinds of experiences. And yet Jesus tells us that in the midst of our experience of grief and mourning, there's something else there. Something powerful which comes into reach in those moments that other times are out of reach for us. And so if we find ourselves in that place, or maybe you're currently experiencing this space at the moment, then there's a unique opportunity to recognize the presence and activity of Jesus. There's something of deep and immeasurable value. Because if we take Jesus at his word, then he promises comfort. More specifically, Jesus promises his comfort. And maybe you've already experienced that yourself. Like we discussed last week, maybe you can readily identify those moments where you've reached the limits of yourself through poverty of spirit or mourning, and God meets you there and unearths something new. I wonder if you can relate. Well, for the rest of our time here together, we're going to take a different approach to this topic. Today, we've got the privilege and the opportunity to hear from someone who has experienced the depths of grief and mourning in more than one way. And we get the chance to explore how this beatitude relates to her experience. And so with that said, I'd like to invite Kathy Smith to the stage. Let's make her feel welcome. Come on up, Kathy. Feel free to take a seat. Now, for those of you who might not know Kathy's part of our Syndal Baptist Church family here. She's also a bit of a boss because she's the director of the Karinya Counselling Centre. And so she brings a lot to the table in this area of conversation, both professionally and personally. Kathy, so I'm really grateful. I'm deeply grateful for your willingness to share some of your story with us today, and I'm sure our church community is as well. So to get started, this teaching from Jesus, it revolves around the concept of mourning, which is an incredibly tough area of life in all its forms. And you are someone who knows what it is to mourn. Could you share some of that journey with us?
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for having me, and hello, everyone. My experience with mourning has been deep and intense the last 7 or 8 years. I was blessed to have a beautiful daughter, Madeline Merle, who was born to me on the 28th of February 1996. Beautiful girl, and I raised her as a single mum, and that's very challenging. There's a lot of loss involved in that in its own forms. And I would say I raised my daughter with the help of some family and friends, but did a lot of it on my own. So when she graduated year 12, I was very pleased and proud, and I was thankful that she had a healthy life mostly. And within 6 months of that graduation, Madeline turned 18, but was also diagnosed with Ewing sarcoma, which is an aggressive bone and soft tissue tumour, and she had it in this part of her leg. And that was a shock and a very scary thing. And at that time, she was then involved in 17 rounds of very intense and grueling chemotherapy, with a hospital admission in the midst of each of one of those rounds of treatment, because she'd become febrile neutropenic, which means your white blood cells aren't there to fight any infections. So we'd have an admission through ED and a stay in hospital with each of those rounds. And within 12 months, really, I was really at the end of myself. Those that know me know I'm a psychologist, and I've been passionate about psychology and its ability to help people. But every strategy I knew just wasn't enough to sustain me in that time. So I well and truly reached the end of myself and found that I was crying out to God. Now, God, I hadn't really known in my life. I figured God was out there, and I figured he was, running things, but didn't realise that I had a need to know him. But that, getting to the end of myself and crying out to him, I sensed I really actually need to know who this is I'm crying out to. And in all truth and honesty, he met me there. Like when I was open-hearted and crying out to him, he met me in that. And so I can testify that he does come close to the brokenhearted, and he will comfort us in our mourning. And I guess my part in that was to seek him in it. And, Madeline completed those 17 rounds, and we had a period where she seemed free of disease, and she was all set to come down to Melbourne to study at La Trobe. She had a big surgery to remove that tumour, and a prosthetic was placed in her leg, and in the journey of that and her love for science, she decided to study prosthetics and orthotics at La Trobe.
Yeah.
And the night before getting on the plane to come down, she was re-scanned, and it was diagnosed that it had returned, this cancer, in her lungs, which means it's metastasised. And that meant lining up again for another year of treatment. So she postponed her studies, postponed coming to Melbourne. And that year again was so challenging, and it was such a trial because she had a stem cell transplant, which involves a chemo that wipes out your bone marrow where the new cells are created. So it was trying to rid her body of that disease. For 7 weeks, she was hospitalised, and all the functioning of her body wasn't working. In addition to my story in finding Christ, Madeline had her own encounter with Jesus that year before. Such a kind God. He reached out to her and she accepted. And during those 7 weeks where her body wasn't working, and that's so tough for a 19-year-old, she was pressing into Jesus. Like, she was listening to music that was resonating with her, and she was really pressing into Joni Eareckson Tada's story, a young woman who was paralysed, who was lying in a hospital bed and who came to know Christ. And there was a song that Mad resonated with, which was, God is on my side and I know that he loves me. And she sang that throughout that time. So I'm thankful that God found us, and we found him in return during that time. And it sustained me, it sustained Madeline, because again, she got through that and was cleared of disease. And she travelled down here in October of 2016, and we had a couple of months. I came down as well because I was like, I'm not staying in Brisbane now, I'm going to come down and be close to my girl. And I was nervous about that because I had a life in Brisbane, but God made a way for all that to fall into place. And Madeline had just started again at La Trobe, and this disease showed up again in her lungs. And the oncologist down here said, Matt, I think you've been through so much. We're not going to keep treating beyond just some radiation and to keep it at bay. But you're now diagnosed terminal. So 2017, she turned 21 on the 28th of Feb, and that diagnosis came on the 1st of March. So we celebrated her 21st together as a family, and it was an amazing day. And then from the 1st of March, we were facing a terminal diagnosis. And that's a time of dread for anyone that experiences that with a loved one. Mad had her own journey, which was amazing because she endured a lot. And she showed up at church every Sunday and smiled. She knew she was loved. And as a mum, there's a dread that comes with that knowledge and a process. And I've just got to say, it's only through bearing close to Jesus that I've been able to come through that well.
Thanks for sharing, Kathy. Today we're considering these words that Jesus said, blessed are those who mourn, for they'll be comforted. Having experienced what you have, what do those words mean for you?
It's an interesting thing because with Mad being diagnosed terminal, she passed away on the 6th of November 2017, and so yesterday was the 4th anniversary. And in the lead up to her death, there's an anticipatory type of grief that I probably didn't know about until having that experience, where you're grieving your loved one while they're still here. And for me, pressing into Jesus and allowing him into that space meant that he could truly minister into my broken heart. And my heart was completely broken. It was completely, really broken apart. And I remember times of thinking, my soul is actually shredded here. Like, I'm just shredded from the inside out. And that woundedness is what he promises to meet us in. He binds up the brokenhearted. And, you know, those that are brokenhearted and contrite in spirit, he will not despise. So I can say that I was desperate, but that desperateness meant my heart was open and he was able to minister deeply into my heart. And that promise and that ability for him to comfort me, it's supernatural, really. It's a supernatural comfort. Because you can't always feel it tangibly, but you know that he is. And then also he provided comfort through his people. People who know him, who follow him, who love him, are able to provide that to people who are mourning, to people who are hurting. So in those ways, he comforted me. So, yeah, it's a strange thing. I remember thinking, I'm not lucky, but I am blessed. And I'm truly blessed because I've been able to come to know Jesus in ways that I would not have been able to know him without that experience. And there's something very special and important in that. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing, Kathy. We're going to pan out for a little bit because this beatitude speaks not just to grief and mourning over the loss of a loved one. It also refers to grieving over the state of things, our world, ourselves, and our awareness or recognition of our own failures before God. What's been your experience, or can you speak to your experience of this broader sense of mourning and the comfort that Jesus offers in the midst of that?
Thanks, Mike. I would say in that process of my heart being completely broken, and it is being repaired, he is binding it up, it is happening. In the process of my heart being broken, he's also softened me. And that means that I care more about the events that are happening in the world. When I used to watch the news and see horrible events happening, I used to think, that's awful, but I'm not feeling that much. I now feel those things deeply. But beyond what's happening in the world, it's happening for me very personally in moving around the community and interacting with people, but also in my job in Karinya, in counselling. I would say that I've always had a burden for people who are hurting. That attracted me to wanting to help in the first place. But since coming to know Jesus, there's a grieving that I have for people that are hurt or hurting, that are wounded by their own sin or the sin of others, by their own actions that have hurt them or the actions of others that have hurt them. And there are horrific things that happen with how we treat each other at times. The abuse that can happen, the mistreatment, the hurts that we carry because of that. I grieve for that in a way that's different. But I'm also learning to trust Jesus in that, like trust Jesus in counselling, that because I was counselling for a long time before becoming a Christian, I carried a lot of that myself or in my own strength, and I'm learning to unburden myself and share that with Jesus. He wants to be our burden carrier. It is his, and by partnering with him in that counselling setting, it's just a wonderful thing that's happening in terms of more holistic healing for myself and others. So I think that's part of what's changing and being transformed.
Kathy, would you mind speaking into, this is a little curveball question, so I'll ask for forgiveness later on. In terms of, like, we find ourselves in a moment where we can find out the heartbreaking details of things that are going on around our nation and around our world as well, and it's beamed into our TV screens, our phones, our computers. And at times I've felt internally, at times overwhelmed over the sheer amount of brokenness in a world that is also beautiful, but at times it just seems like the brokenness and dysfunction is so in view. Could you speak to some ways in which to navigate this space in a healthy kind of way, to be able to not become apathetic or turned off from what's going on around our world, but also not being overwhelmed by the torrent of news that comes our way?
What's worked for me is in my process of following Jesus, being led by him, and I've found what he does in his kindness is just give me probably what I can cope with. So I would suggest it's about loving the one in front of you, and if he leads you to care for a child who's poor by making donations, or care for someone that's hurting in front of you, where you know they've lost someone they love, getting alongside them to just be there, that kind of thing. And if you are overwhelmed, that's okay too. What I've found so helpful is to align myself with God, with his word every morning, so that I'm seeking him first, and then everything else comes after that. He says it in his word and it works. If we seek him first, he looks after those other things. But there are times I'm overwhelmed as well. This last pandemic, with the isolation, being home alone too much, I experienced a deep depression. And one of the things that really helped was sitting down and reading Psalms and writing them out and praising God in it. And it transformed it. And I wrote, he's ministering deep in my heart because my heart is hurting and open to him. And that works. So we can be overwhelmed by this fallen world and its brokenness. I don't think it's our job, we're not God, to fix that. He's got it, he's covering it, but it is to partner with him as he leads us with those in front of us and that we're encountering each day.
Yeah, that's good. Thanks, Kathy. We've been speaking a lot about comfort in the now. And yet the promise of this beatitude has that now and not yet kind of reality. So it's comfort in the present, but also it's like a taster. It's not fully realized until like this hope that we have when God will make all things new. Can you tell us about your view of the not yet comfort, the comfort that's yet to come, and your experience of that, the way you think through this and process it?
I think it's in his promises, the hope that's yet to come and what he holds for us in eternity. Revelation chapter 7:17, where he says, God will wipe every tear from our eyes. Like, that's a blessed future hope that, you know, when my child has gone to be with Jesus, well before I would have chosen, it really helps set my heart and mind on heaven, on eternity. And that helps. And I'm coming to believe more and more the reality of his promise that he will return and that it will be the perfect creation that he planned. And I think, look, he's placed eternity in every one of our hearts. So I have a longing for that. I think we all have a longing for that. And it's why when we look at the world as it is, it's like, oh God, you know, this is not how you planned it to be. And yet there is beauty in his creation. So it's this constant paradox. And there is joy that he offers us in him here. So I've needed to draw that comfort into the present because it's now and not yet. He will comfort us now and there's more to come. But that hope in the future, that's something awesome to hold on to. But you know, I couldn't quite grasp that initially. It's taking time to come in and take full effect.
Right, work in progress.
It is a work in progress. I'm a total work in progress.
As are we all, I've just got one last question for you, Kathy. Speaking about this promise of comfort that's now, but also not yet. I've had the chance to hear parts of your story before, and I've watched you live your life with this beautiful, vibrant faith that just overflows, and it impacts the way you work in your professional career, the way that you are socially, the way you are with friends and family. And I guess my question is whether there was anything that you did to allow the truth of this promise and this teaching that we've been looking at today to unfold in your life. Because I'm sure, I feel this personally, I'm sure there's people in the room and watching online who find themselves in the midst of grief and know this teaching of Jesus, but maybe it doesn't feel like it rings true just yet. You spoke yourself about it's been a progress thing for you. Can you think of anything that you might have done, or can you think of anything that might have helped you experience the fullness of this promise in increasing measure?
I think I've touched on it already. And it is allowing Jesus into that place within you that's hurting, not keeping it separate, acknowledging really that there is grief and loss and mourning in this life, and that he is a suffering servant, as Mandy said earlier. It always amazes me, because I've been reflecting on Isaiah 61 in preparation for this, because these Beatitudes reflect that as well. It's amazing that he is a suffering servant. He knows the experience, and I can trust him, and you can trust him in those deepest, darkest places in our hearts. By letting him in, he will bind up our broken heart. And it's seeking him daily. And for some people, that's a quiet time. For me, that works when I can sit down and read his word. And sometimes it's beyond my capacity. So through the pandemic, I've been listening to the audio Bible because it's been an easier way to absorb it.
Yeah, right.
And I've been listening to worship music because it's singing his word. It uplifts our heart and soul. That's a way of uplifting our eyes to heaven in a beautiful way. And I just think it's so like God to give us song to uplift us.
Yeah.
He's just a brilliant God. Like, the weapons of our warfare are spiritual things like that. Worship and song and prayer. What a brilliant God. So I would encourage, it's aligning yourself with him daily, and everything else comes after that. And it's okay to be creative in that.
Yeah.
Do what works. Do what helps you align with him and feel his spirit bringing you to life. Do those things.
That's some good wisdom. Well, Kathy, I want to thank you so much for your courage and your vulnerability in sharing a deeply personal part of your life story here today. And I know it's not easy, and I know that it comes at a cost for you to talk about this. And so I want to thank you so much, and I think our church would like to thank you so much. So can we express our appreciation for Kathy? Nice. Kathy, you can just sit back and relax now. Let me just wrap up. We've just heard Kathy's experiences of mourning and seen a glimpse of the truth and the comfort that this second beatitude can bring. But within this room and within the broader community online, there are many stories and experiences that relate to the things that we've been focusing on today. And my hope is that this conversation doesn't end here. If you have similar experiences of your own, then you might like to share and talk about that with someone for the first time, or maybe as part of a continuing conversation. And this is where one of the great gifts of community within our church emerges, because we do not need to navigate the highs and lows of life on our own. We can walk this road together. And so you might like to start or perhaps continue a conversation with someone, maybe it's in your life group, a friend, family member, or a trusted leader. If you would like to debrief some of your experiences with a trained professional, then Karinya Counselling has excellent practitioners like Kathy, with whom that you can make an appointment to see. Or perhaps you'd like prayer. It could be as easy as asking someone on the left or the right of you to pray with and for you. At the end of this service, we'll have a couple of members of our prayer team who'll be up at the back left of this auditorium who would love to sit and chat and pray with you. And for anyone else, either in this room or online, we've also got the chance to request prayer via our Connect link at me.sb.org.au. It'll be on our screens at the end of this service. And at this link, you'll also find further information and contact details about Karinya Counselling, opportunities to connect into the Syndal Baptist community through life groups or some of our age and stage ministries. But to finish out our time in this moment, I would like to pray for us all and allow us to all have just a little moment of reflection and conversation with God in prayer. So you might want to close your eyes. You might want to relax your body. And in this time, we can bring our needs and our griefs before our God, who provides for and comforts us. Let's pray. Our God, in this life, we experience joy and heartache, times of celebration and times of mourning. And at any given moment, we might be experiencing one while someone else is experiencing the opposite. And it's in the mix of highs and lows that we want to become more aware of your presence with us and at work in and through us. God, we think particularly for those who grieve, whether it's we who grieve or those who grieve around us, whether it's recent or as part of an ongoing season, whether it's in response to the loss or challenges of a loved one, whether it's in relation to the state of this world or the state of our lives. God of all comfort, we take Jesus at his word, that blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. And so, God, would you assure us of this? Would you remind us of this? And would you help us experience this in our lives, perhaps for the first time, perhaps in an ongoing way? Our God, in our mourning, and for those in our lives who mourn, we recognize our need for you, and we're asking that you might give us exactly what we need. And it's with hope in the name of Jesus that we pray these things. Amen.